So guys, I'm bringing you my heat weapon build today. After a lot of testing and fine tuning, I got it to perform really well, being able to do 118 missions without much problems. And it's also very important to know that this build can utilize the plasma cannon, plasma gun, multi-melta, Melta Gun and the Lasgun. It's a 5-in-1 build. So please don't dismiss this build because it says heat weapons and not specifically plasma cannon build, for example. In our attributes, I went with a maxed out warfare for the damage bonus and also a maxed out toughness for the damage reduction and resistances. But if you wanted to have more damage, you could take 10 points out of here and put him in virtue for another 35%. The most important perk for survivability is the Blessing of Saint Victorious. Then I like to play with Augmented Body 2, which makes it much easier to stay in the green suppression state. And this time around I tried the Armory of Seal perk, which gives us an infinite amount of mine and grenade charges, as long as we keep our resource up. In our stats I have a good amount of defenses, a high crit chance is very important so we can keep our enrich tokens up. Try to get your crit strength high enough so you break through one of the thresholds. Most of the heat weapon skills are single target based, so I have a higher boost in it than in AoE damage. And I have a nearly maxed out cooldown reduction. That's also very important since many of the heat weapon skills have a very long cooldown. Lastly, try to boost your vulnerability effectiveness as much as possible for a huge damage boost. The neural implant will be our enrich token source. Also the shock and slow debuffs will be really easily applied, since we aren't just applying heat vulnerability, but also general vulnerability and the other two types as well with our armor. On the eye implant, damage per enrich token and a bunch of boosts to our crits. The increased vulnerability duration can be really useful, but it's kinda hard to get. I found out that I can never get it when I reroll a single enchant. It only appeared for me when I used the reroll all enchant button. I'm using the main implant of Wrath for another 9 enrich tokens and a socket single target shards and a vulnerability psalm code inside. Until you can get the main implant, you can use the normal relic main implant with the damage per enrich token enchant instead. With this enchant on our purity seal, in combination with our armor enchant, we can trigger a lot of shocks. And with the Psalm Doctrine in our weapon, those shocks deal decent heat AoE damage, which will be really useful, since many of the heat weapon attacks are single target based. So this combination will really speed up our clear time. The cooldown reduction, all resist and suppression reduction is obvious, but you might wonder why I'm using those enchants on a heat weapon build. First, you have to know that both bleed and poison count as a debuff. I'm not using them for the damage itself, but I'm using them for the damage boost I'm getting from our weapon enchant. And the way we can apply them consistently is with our secondary craft gun weapon, since its skills are physical damage based. In my belt slot I'm using a stun mine with this enchant, which will give us a good amount of healing. As an alternative you can use the stun grenade. Both apply the stun debuff and deal extreme suppression damage. The enchants are pretty obvious. The one thing I want to mention is that the belt slot is one of the few items that can roll suppression on hit, so try to always get that enchant. I socketed vulnerability effectiveness and one Ordinato Psalm, so we have a way to reduce armor. If you don't want to play with a stun mine or a grenade, you can also play with a Rosarius force field or a refractor field with the same enchant, and then just exchange this perk for something else. For example this one, or this one. For our armor, try to get the ancient relic one with the shattering enchant, but it doesn't have to be a demolition armor. As I mentioned before, this will be a great source to apply all kinds of vulnerabilities and really push our damage up by a lot. But it's of course not that easy to get, so before you can get that, you can play with this perk instead. It has a similar effect and you just get a slight damage reduction, which isn't that bad. I would exchange this perk either for the Mind skill or the Augmented Body. For sockets, I went with the Ethereal Psalm Doctrine, which is amazing for survivability, and it even gives us inoculator charges. And in the last open slot I put one suppression shard, but you could exchange it for a vulnerability effectiveness if you wanted to have more damage. On the inoculator I'm using the Fear Aura enchant. It gives us another debuff source, and in combination with this signum we can stack up general vulnerabilities extremely fast in a 5 meter radius. If you wanna know more about it, you can check out my advanced player guide. The most important enchants here are the attributes and the chance to reset the inoculator on kill. If you are playing with mines or grenades, you can reroll this enchant, but if you are playing with a force field, then I would keep this enchant. I socket again the same as before, and as components 1 Blood Balm for healing, 2 times Psychon for 400% damage, and 1 Hold Fast to make it last longer. On our weapons, we will have a similar setup. The damage per debuff enchant will give us a huge damage boost, and I would always roll a heat cost reduction, so you can just keep firing your weapon without overheating. I also would always get crit chance, but for enchants like this one, it will depend on your weapon. For example here on the plasma cannon, I boosted the overdrive discharge, since it's a single target salvo skill, which means I can just keep firing without draining my enrich tokens, and deal decent damage without having a high cooldown, like those 2 other skills. But the enchant will of course depend on your weapon. For example on the Lasgun, I boosted the short burst, since it's the most useful skill. Or here on the plasma gun, I rolled supreme cooldown reduction for short burst, since it's one of the best skills of the weapon, being rapid fire and armor breaking, but it has a really high cooldown. I also quickly want to mention that the Lasgun and the Melta Gun get the damage by debuff enchant on an Arcutech relic version, which means they have a chance to have the enhanced red skills. The Multi-Melta, the Plasma Gun and the Plasma Cannon don't have an Arcutech relic version with this enchant. For the sockets we are using the Shock Explosion Doctrine to deal great AoE damage. For signums I'm using the damage per enrich token one. The most important enchants here are the cooldown reduction and the crit chance. For some weapons like the Plasma Gun and the Multi-Melta, you will have a harder time to keep enrich tokens up if you are using this enchant. For them you can just exchange it to this one. The second signum will be this one, giving us another huge damage boost. And again, cooldown and crit chance are most important here. For our secondary weapon, you can either use the Grav Gun and the Gravity Implosion, or you can use the Heavy Flamer and those 2 attacks. I prefer the Grav Gun. It's just an amazing support weapon, spreading debuffs, giving a lot of enrich tokens with its fast ticking hits, and if you socket HP and suppression on hit, you can use it as a nice healing alternative. And as I mentioned before, it will allow us to apply poison and bleed. For the signums I'm using a similar setup to maximize its damage. Let me show you now an alternative setup. If you don't like to play with the Shock Explosion combo, or if you feel you are not dealing enough single target damage that way, you can socket the Heat Damage Doctrine and 1 vulnerability effectiveness in your weapon, exchange your Purity Seal for this one that gives you the Fear Aura enchant, and then exchange the Inoculator enchant for the one that gives you HP regeneration for every vulnerability stack, which we will have a lot of, since we apply all kinds of vulnerabilities, plus the general vulnerability. So you will get another huge healing boost from that. For our passives, I have a nearly maxed out single target tree. I got everything but this. In the AoE tree, I put a few points to get this passive, and if you're playing with a grenade, I would also get this one. In the crit tree, everything but this one. Here we get some healing, a bunch of crit chance, a way to replenish our class resource, and another 100% damage bonus. In the heat attacks tree, we get some overheat reduction, a way to apply burns, which will also count as another debuff, and most importantly a way to apply heat vulnerabilities. In the support tree, 1 point to increase my inoculator capacity. This will bring it up to a 30, which means I get 3 charges instead of 2. and then 3 points here, so we get more focus, which is important since we are using focus to use our grenades and mines. In the debuff tree, we get another nice damage boost, and with this we get a lot of suppression, since we are stunning a lot of enemies, and we can also often benefit from strike down, since there are a bunch of skills like this one that apply knockdown and knockback. The passives in the movement tree are very important for this build, especially this one gives us a huge amount of cooldown reduction. And you don't really have to use those 3 skills, you can use those points somewhere else if you need. I put 1 point in the radical tree for a little bit more damage bonus, but you don't need that, you can play this build also on a Puritan Crusader. In the health tree, I put points to get this passive, which gives me another way to reset my inoculator, and with this passive I have another way to gain some suppression points. Lastly, the defense tree gives us a lot of resistances, some deflect and the death protection. Let me show you now a 118 mission. If you have any questions, just ask me in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
And such a vast threat can only be fought with ingenuity. Kill the masters, and you will render a sea of vermin helpless. Damnation is eternal.